The wind howled over the moors, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and smoke from distant hearths. In the small hamlet of Dunsmuir, winter had come early, coating the thatched rooftops in a thin, icy sheen. Inside one of the cottages, a family of 5 huddled together as the cold pressed against their walls like an invisible enemy. The fire in the stone hearth burned low, its orange light flickering over rough-hewn beams and the packed earth floor. Beside the flames, a cow shifted her weight, her breath misting in the chill air. 2 goats lay curled near her, their hooves twitching as they dreamed, and in the corner a hen made soft, contented sounds beneath a straw basket. This was the heart of medieval life, warmth and survival bought not through wealth, but through proximity, through living side by side with the beasts that fed and sustained you. The man of the house, Elric, sat sharpening a blade, the rasp of stone on metal rhythmic and patient. He was not a knight or noble, but a peasant farmer, his hands scarred from years of toil in frozen soil. His wife, Merwen, was sewing by the fire, her needle glinting faintly as she worked by the dim light. Their eldest son, Wolf, only 12, was tasked with tending the animals, ensuring none strayed near the fire or knocked over the water pail. The smell in the cottage was thick, a blend of hay, smoke, wool, and manure. But to the family it was familiar, almost comforting. Outside was far worse. The cold that could crack skin and kill a man in a night if he slept without shelter. Eiric's family was not unusual. In villages like Dunsmuir across England, animals shared homes with people not from affection, but necessity. Eiric's single-room cottage was both barn and dwelling. The dividing wall nothing more than a few planks or sometimes a curtain of woven reeds. The animal's body heat added to the warmth of the fire, creating a small pocket of survivable air in a world that seemed determined to freeze. The nights were long, 14 hours of darkness when the only light came from embers and stars, and the only sounds were breathing, shuffling, and the occasional lowing of the cow. When Wolf had first asked why they couldn't keep the animals outside like in the Lordess manor, Elric had laughed, though not unkindly, because, boy, he had said, the Lord's beasts have stone walls and straw enough to bury a man. Ours have what we give them, and we give them this roof. The boy had nodded, though he still found it strange to wake each morning with the bleating of goats beside his head, and the heavy musk of livestock thick in the air. Yet as the winter deepened, he began to understand. On nights when the wind screamed and the frost gathered on the inside of the windows, the warmth of the animals was the only thing between them and death. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air and a swirl of snowflakes. Elric rose, his knife still in hand, but it was only his neighbour, Osric, come to barter. He stamped his boots and cursed the cold, pulling his wool cloak tighter. Fire's dying, Osric said, nodding toward the hearth. Wood's getting scarce. Elric grunted. I took the axe to the coppice today, but the ground's like iron. Osric's gaze wandered to the animals. You're lucky, Elric. That cow of yours gives heat enough for 3 men. Aye, Elric replied, and milk. Enough to keep my children from starving. The 2 men sat near the fire, trading small comforts, a handful of oats for a skin of ale, as their wives exchanged talk of sickness, bread, and prayer. Life was a chain of small exchanges, each one meant to keep the dark at bay for another night. Merwen finished her stitching and set it aside, rubbing her eyes. The baby, Edric, stirred in his cradle, crying softly. She picked him up, wrapping him in a coarse wool blanket, and the child's wails quieted as she pressed him close to her breast. He's cold, she murmured, and Osric's wife, Hilda, nodded. The church says we should be thankful for what we have, she said. But I'd be more thankful if I had a roof without holes. They laughed softly, the kind of laughter that kept tears away. Elric poked at the fire, and the cow gave a low sound, uneasy. Storm's coming, he muttered. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the door and sending thin fingers of air through the cracks in the wall. When the snowstorm finally hit, it came with a fury that swallowed the village whole. The next morning, Dunsmuir lay buried under white drifts, the fields invisible, the paths erased. For 3 days, no one left their homes. Eoric's family survived on what they had stored, salted meat, root vegetables, and thin ale. Each night they pressed closer together, the animals shifting in the dark. their warmth seeping into the humans beside them. Wolf could feel the cow's flank against his back as he slept, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing almost soothing. In the corner, Merwin sang softly to Edric, her voice mingling with the crackle of the fire. Outside, wolves prowled the frozen woods, their howls echoing like ghosts, but inside the cottage, life held on stubbornly. One morning, the fire went out completely. The last of the wood was gone, and Elric knew that if he didn't act, they'd all freeze before the week was out. He took his axe and prepared to go, but Merwin grabbed his arm. "The snow's too deep," she said, fear in her eyes. "You'll never make it to the forest." He kissed her forehead and smiled grimly. "Then I'll not go to the forest. I'll go to Osric's. He's closer." He pushed open the door, vanishing into the white storm. The minutes dragged into hours. Wolf kept feeding the animals bits of straw and scraping the frost from their water trough. By evening, when Elric returned with a bundle of wood tied to his back, his beard was frozen stiff and his fingers were white as bone. But he was alive, and the fire burned again that night. As the days passed, Wolf began to see the animals differently. They were not just beasts for work and food, they were partners in survival. He watched the steam rise from their bodies in the cold air, and realized that each breath was shared warmth, each heartbeat another chance at life. His mother sometimes spoke of the saints and angels who watched over them, but Wolf began to think that perhaps their true guardians had for legs and fur. When spring finally came, it did not arrive gently. The fall brought mud, sickness and hunger, but also life. The snow melted into the soil, the grass returned, and the world smelled of wet earth again. The animals were led outside to graze, their hooves sinking into the soft ground. The family followed, blinking in the sunlight, thin but alive. Elric placed a hand on Wolf's shoulder. "You see, boy," he said, looking out over the greening field, "we kept each other alive, man and beast. That's how it's always been." Wolf nodded, understanding now what his father had meant months ago. That night, as the family slept, the cow lowed softly in her corner of the cottage, and the warmth of her breath drifted across the room. Wolf smiled in his sleep. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside there was peace, the ancient, shared peace of humans and animals who had learned to survive together in a world of endless cold. The thaw had come too fast that year. The snow melted into rivers that ran through the lanes of Dunsmuir, turning every path into mud and every field into a bog. The people of the village said the earth was bleeding out winter. The ground that had been hard as iron now sucked at boots and hooves alike, and the air smelled of wet straw, dung, and smoke. For Eoric's family, the new season brought both relief and worry. Relief, because the cruel frost had finally retreated. Worry, because now the real work began, the ploughing, sowing, and mending that determined whether they would eat come winter again. The animals were restless. The cow lowed each morning, eager for fresh grass after months in the dark cottage. The goats butted the door with their heads, impatient to be led outside. Even the hens, half wild after the long confinement, pecked at the floor as if trying to dig their way out. Wolf was the first to open the door one morning, letting the smell of thawing soil rush in. The animals pushed past him in a clatter of hooves and feathers, bursting into the grey daylight. He laughed for the first time in months, running after them with bare feet splashing through the mud. His father followed with slower steps, smiling faintly as he watched his son chase the creatures that had kept them alive all winter. That evening, as the family sat near the hearth, the talk turned to rebuilding. The roof had leaked during the worst storms and several timbers had rotted through. Elric would need to cut new wood from the forest, though it meant leaving the fields for a few days. "We can't mend the house without wood," he said, looking at Merwin. She nodded, though she looked tired. Her hands were raw from washing clothes in cold water. "Go, then," she said. "But take Wolf with you. He's old enough to help now." Wolf's eyes lit up. It was rare that his father asked him to come along on such work. The next morning, they set out at dawn, leading the ox that would pull their small cart. The forest stood dark and heavy on the horizon, a tangle of oaks and ash. As they walked, Elric spoke of old things, of how his grandfather had built the cottage with his own hands, how the land had once belonged to no lord, and how in those days a man's roof was his freedom. Wolf listened, half dreaming, his breath steaming in the chill morning air. When they reached the forest, the silence there was different from the open fields. It pressed in, full of unseen life, the rustle of branches, the cry of distant crows. They chose fallen trees first, ones half-rotten but still useful. Elric swung his axe in slow, steady rhythm, each strike echoing through the woods. Wolf gathered kindling, stacking branches and watching the chips of wood fly. As they worked, a strange unease crept over him. The forest was vast, older than the village, older than the church. The stories said that spirits lived in such places, woodwives and fai who punished those who took too much. When he told his father this, Elric chuckled, but not unkindly. The forest takes what it wants, he said. If you respect it, it will feed you. If you don't, it will swallow you whole. Wolf nodded, repeating the words quietly like a charm. By midday, they had gathered enough. The ox strained against the cart as they turned back toward Dunsmuir. The sun broke through the clouds, pale and watery, glinting off the wet road. We'll need to work fast, Elric said. Spring storms are worse than winter's chill. When they returned, Merwin had already cleared the floor and patched the hearth. The cow was back inside, chewing cud, her soft eyes following them as they entered. The cottage smelled again of animals and earth, a reminder that, though the seasons changed, their way of life did not. That night, after the evening meal of pottage and bread, Wolf lay awake beside the fire. The cow's breathing filled the silence, and in the shadows, he could just make out the shape of the goats curled near the wall. He thought about what his father had said, that their home was their freedom, yet it didn't feel like freedom, not truly. It felt more like a fragile truce between hunger and survival, between man and beast. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of life around him, the crackle of wood, the shifting of hooves, the whisper of wind through the thatch. In the weeks that followed, the work never seemed to end. The villagers ploughed their shared fields, each man's strip marked by stones and memory. Eoric's plough creaked as the ox trudged through the muck, and Wolf followed, scattering seed by hand. Above them, crows circled, waiting for the chance to snatch the grain. When night fell, they returned to their cottage, exhausted but alive. Merwin milked the cow, the warm stream of milk hissing into the pail, and little Edric clapped his hands at the sound. The animals, too, settled back into their rhythm, not merely livestock, but silent witnesses to every moment of human struggle. One evening, as the family ate by firelight, Osric came knocking again, his face pale and drawn. The fever's taken to in the village, he said. Old Girth and his wife. The priest says it's God's testing. Merwin crossed herself. Testing or punishment? She asked softly. Does it matter? Elric said, his voice heavy. The sickness comes when it wills. They closed the door and barred it, as though wood and iron could keep illness away. For days afterward, Wolf noticed that his mother burned herbs by the hearth, muttering prayers as she waved the smoke through the air. The smell clung to everything, sharp, bitter, protective. The animals grew restless again. Perhaps they sensed what the people could not. The fever spread quickly, taking the old and weak first. The villagers said it came from bad air, from the mists that rose from the marshes. Eoric's family stayed inside more often, living in the dim half-light of the cottage. The animals' warmth filled the space, but so did their smell, thick, suffocating, constant. Wolf began to understand the price of this life. To survive, they had to share everything, even breath. One night, a sharp cry woke him. The cow had stumbled, her breathing ragged. Elric rose immediately, kneeling beside her. She's sick, Merwin whispered. Not her too. They worked through the night, tending to the animal with poultices and whispered prayers. At dawn, the cow's breathing eased. Wolf sat beside her, stroking her rough hide. She saved us all winter, he said quietly. We can't let her die. His father looked at him, eyes tired but proud. You understand now, he said. We live because they live. Spring deepened into early summer, and though the fever still haunted the edges of Dunsmuir, Eoric's family endured. The fields grew green, the streams ran clear again, and the sound of birds returned to the mornings. The cow recovered slowly, thinner but alive. The family's gratitude was quiet but deep, a prayer spoken not in church, but through the simple act of care. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air filled with the smell of grass and smoke, Elric sat with his son outside the cottage. You've grown this year, he said. You see now why we keep them close? Wolf nodded. Because they're part of us. Elric smiled. Aye, and because the world is cold, boy, too cold for men to live alone. The light faded and they went back inside where the animals waited. The fire flickered to life again, and with it came the warmth of everything that had carried them through, the beasts, the earth, and the stubborn will to keep breathing against the odds. The summer sun hung low over Dunsmuir, casting long shadows across the thatched cottages and open fields. The smell of earth and hay filled the air, mingled with the faint tang of smoke from the hearths that never truly went out. For Aelric's family, life had settled into the rhythm of the season. Hard work from dawn till dusk, brief laughter in the evenings, and quiet prayers whispered before sleep. The memory of winter still lingered, carved deep into their bones like an old scar. Yet with each warm day, that memory softened, replaced by the hum of bees and the rustle of wheat swaying under the breeze. Wolf had grown taller since the frost had lifted. His hands bore the same calluses as his father's, and he had learned the language of the animals when a cow's lowing meant hunger, when it meant warning, when it meant pain. He could tell by the twitch of a goat's ear if it sensed rain before the sky darkened. He knew how to hold a frightened hen without breaking its wings. To him, the creatures were no longer beasts but neighbors, each with its own place in the rhythm of their lives. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Merwin sat by the fire, weaving new cloth from the spring's wool. The sound of the spinning wheel filled the small cottage, steady and soothing. Elric mended a broken harness, his knife scraping gently against the leather. Outside, Wolf tended the cow, brushing her hide with careful strokes. The animal sighed softly, her warmth like a small, half of its own. Good girl, Wolf murmured. You kept us alive when the snow fell. The cow blinked her large brown eyes as though she understood. That night, the air was unusually still. The sounds of crickets and frogs drifted in through the window, mingling with the soft breathing of the animals. Wolf lay awake, staring at the thatch roof, watching how the moonlight traced faint silver lines across the beams. He thought about the coming harvest, about the stories the elders told around the midsummer fires, stories of bad omens, of storms that could wipe out a year's work in a single night. His father said the only way to fight such fears was through labor and faith. But Wolf wondered if that was enough. The next day, clouds gathered early. Dark and heavy, they rolled over the hills like a warning. Elric looked up from the fields and frowned. We'll have rain, he said. Best bring the hay in. The family worked quickly, pulling in what they could, stacking it under the eaves where it might stay dry. The animals were restless, shifting and snorting as thunder rumbled in the distance. When the storm finally broke, it came with sudden violence, sheets of rain, flashes of lightning, and a wind that howled like something alive. Inside the cottage, the family huddled close. The fire sputtered, the smoke curling up into the rafters. The cow bellowed once, frightened, and the goats bleated in reply. The children clung to Merwin's skirts as the thunder shook the walls. It's just the sky splitting, Elric said, trying to sound calm. It'll pass. But even he glanced at the door, as though half expecting it to burst open. The rain pounded on the roof, seeping through the weak spots, dripping onto the floor. Merwin placed pots beneath the leaks, her hands trembling slightly. When morning came, the storm had moved on, but its damage remained. The fields were soaked, the river had overflowed, and several cottages in the lower part of the village had been flooded. Dunsmuir's people moved like ghosts through the mud, helping each other where they could. Aelric's home had survived better than most. The animals had kept the walls steady, their warmth preventing the worst of the damp from taking hold. Still, one of the goats had gone missing during the night. Wolf and his father searched for her through the marshy fields. They found her at last near the edge of the forest, caught in a tangle of branches. She was frightened but unharmed. She must have broken loose when the thunder hit, Elric said. Wolf untangled her carefully, whispering softly to calm her. As they led her home, Wolf noticed the marks the rain had left on the land, gullies carved into the soil, trees bent low, a world reshaped by water. It struck him then how fragile everything was. A single night of anger from the heavens, and all a man's work could be undone. When they returned, Merwin had been tending to the others in the village. She had taken bread and milk to an old widow whose roof had collapsed, and she'd returned pale from exhaustion. "The priest says we must give thanks that none were killed," she said, stirring the pot of pottage. "He says God spared us for a reason." Elric grunted. "Or maybe the roof just held better." Merwin frowned. "Don't speak that way before the children." Elric sighed. "I only mean the world doesn't always need a reason to test us." That evening, Osric came by again, his cloak soaked from the rain. He spoke of a new levy, the Lord demanding extra grain to pay for repairs to the manor road. The villagers grumbled, but there was nothing to be done. "We give," Elric said quietly after Osric left. "We always give." Merwin nodded, though her face was set in a weary kind of anger. "And still they call us blessed." In the days that followed, the village worked to dry the fields. The sun returned, hotter than before, and the air filled with the smell of wet hay turning sweet again. Wolf helped his father build a new trough, the cow standing nearby, patient as ever. "She's stronger than some men I know," Elric said with a chuckle. Wolf replied. "She doesn't complain." Elric looked at him, smiling faintly. "You've learned her ways too well." By midsummer, the fields were green again. The feast day came with bells from the small church and laughter echoing through the lanes. The villagers danced around a pole dressed with flowers, and for a brief time, even the memory of hunger and cold seemed far away. Wolf watched the fire that night, its light flickering over faces made soft with wine and warmth. He thought about how short these moments were, the small bursts of peace between seasons of hardship. When they returned home, the animals were waiting, calm and familiar. The cottage smelled of hay and smoke, of milk and sweat, of life. Wolf lay beside the hearth, the cows slow breathing behind him, the fire's glow on his face. He realized that this closeness, man and beast under the same roof, was more than survival. It was a pact, a wordless agreement forged over centuries, binding them together against the cold, the storms, and the hunger that never truly left. He drifted to sleep listening to the cow's steady heart, the faint creak of the beams above, and his mother's soft humming as she tended the fire. Outside, the moon rose over the fields, silvering the thatch and the trees. The world was quiet again, fragile, fleeting, and human. The heat of midsummer settled over Dunsmuir like a heavy blanket, pressing down on the thatched roofs and fields with an almost tangible weight. The sun rose early, spilling light across the village, illuminating the worn paths and a few trees that offered sparse shade. Inside Eoric's cottage, the air was thick with the smell of straw, sweat, and the lingering tang of smoke from the hearth. The animals shifted as the warmth pressed in, the cow lying with her flanks against the earth, her sides rising and falling slowly while the goats nuzzled each other for comfort. Wolf sat on the floor beside the fire, scraping mud from the soles of his boots and thinking about the day ahead, already planning the order in which he would feed, brush and water each creature. Merwin moved with quiet efficiency, carrying pails of water from the small stream just beyond the garden. The baby, Edric, clung to her hip, his tiny hands gripping her coarse tunic. She hummed softly, a song of work and rhythm, her voice mixing with the low groans of the cow and the occasional squawk of the hens. Outside, Elric prepared the ox for the day's labor, checking the yoke, loosening ropes, and murmuring soft words to keep the animal calm. The fields were still wet from recent rains, but they had to be plowed, for if the seed did not take root soon, the harvest would fail and hunger would follow. Wolf led the goats out first, their hooves clattering against the wooden floor before they stumbled into the mud outside. He watched them run across the fields, their small bodies agile and full of life. The cow followed more slowly, guided by Eoric's firm but gentle hand. Wolf admired the way his father moved, confident, careful, a balance of strength and patience learned through decades of labor. As they worked, Elric taught Wolf to read the soil, to feel the dampness beneath his fingers, to know when the earth was ready to receive the plow. The boy listened, absorbing every word, every motion, understanding for the first time that survival depended not on strength alone, but on observation, timing, and respect for the land. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, relentless and bright. Sweat dripped down Eoric's face, soaking the coarse tunic he wore, and Wolf's hands were raw from gripping the wooden plow. They paused for a brief meal, stale bread, a chunk of cheese, and a sip of water from the skin pouch. The cow rested nearby, chewing cud. her warmth a reminder that even labor demanded patience and care. Merwin came out then, bringing a bucket of water and wiping Edric's damp forehead with a cloth. She watched her husband and son, pride softening the lines of her face. "You're learning well," she said quietly. "Better than I could have hoped." The afternoon stretched long. The sky shifted from bright blue to a pale gold, clouds moving slowly across the horizon. Elric worked steadily, sweat and dirt streaking his face, while Wolf followed, helping where he could, mimicking every motion. Occasionally, they paused to inspect a furrow or adjust a strap, and always the animals were near, patient, enduring, their presence a constant reassurance. The rhythm of the day was simple yet profound: labor, care, rest, repeat. In this cycle, the boy found a strange comfort, a sense of belonging that went beyond blood or kinship. The animals were part of his family, their lives intertwined with his own. Evening approached, and the sky deepened to shades of orange and violet. Elric and Wolf led the ox and cow back toward the cottage, the goats bounding ahead. The mud of the fields clung to their hooves, streaking their legs with dark patterns, and the smell of wet earth rose into the warm air. Inside, Merwin had prepared a simple meal, porridge with a little honey and slices of hard bread. The baby cooed happily, and Wolf felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. It was the warmth of life continuing, of hardship met and overcome, of bonds that could not be broken by storm or season. Night fell with a soft hush, the sounds of the village dimming as families settled into their homes. Elric built the fire higher, its light flickering against the rough beams and casting dancing shadows across the walls. The animals were brought in, their movements familiar and steadying. Wolf lay beside the cow, her heat radiating through the floorboards, and felt the steady rhythm of her breathing. He could hear the faint creak of the roof, the distant call of a night bird, the rustle of straw as the goats shifted in their corners. The world outside might rage with wind, rain, or cold, but inside life persisted. Over the next days, the work continued in unbroken rhythm. The fields demanded attention, the animals needed care, and the family endured the sun's heat and occasional summer storms. Wolf grew in strength and understanding. He learned the subtle signals of each animal. The cow's soft stamp of a hoof meant she was restless. The goat's nuzzle could be a plea for food or comfort. The hen's cluck was a warning or a request. Each gesture, no matter how small, was a language he began to speak fluently, and through it, he understood more about survival than he had from any words his father or mother could say. Occasionally, news arrived from the edges of the village. A neighboring family had lost a barn to fire. Another reported illness among the livestock. Elric listened carefully to every report, knowing that misfortune often traveled fast, and he planned accordingly. The family's own small precautions, careful storage of grain, tending the animals inside when storms approached, were not acts of indulgence, but necessity. Wolf observed all of this, learning that foresight and diligence were as important as strength. By late summer, the first signs of the harvest appeared. The wheat stalks stood golden in the sun, bending gently with the weight of ripening grain. Wolf and Elric walked the fields together, inspecting the rows and testing the soil. The ox had grown strong from months of work, the cow fat and healthy, the goats agile and alert. Merwin tended the garden, harvesting herbs and vegetables, preserving some for winter, sharing the rest with neighbors in need. The small cottage was a hive of motion, yet beneath the busyness lay a steady current of calm, a rhythm that tied humans and animals together in a delicate, interdependent web. As the harvest approached, preparations for storage began. Grain was carefully winnowed, stored in baskets, and kept close to the walls of the cottage to prevent spoilage. The cow's milk was churned into butter, eggs collected and cleaned, vegetables pickled or dried. Every act was part of a chain of survival, each step carefully measured. Wolf worked alongside his parents, understanding that this was not labor for work's sake, but a deliberate choreography of endurance. Evening after evening, after the labor was done, the family gathered near the hearth. The animals settled around them, each occupying familiar corners. Wolf lay with the cow, feeling her warmth seep into his tired body. Listening to the low rumble of her breath, he reflected on the months since winter, the storms, the fever, the mud, the endless toil, and realized that the closeness of humans and animals was not merely convenience. It was necessity, yes, but also a quiet comfort, a shared resilience that bound them together in the face of a harsh, unyielding world. Night deepened and the fire flickered lower, shadows stretching across the walls. The family slept as one unit, humans and animals intertwined in the small cottage, a living testament to survival. Outside, the village lay quiet, the fields resting beneath the moonlight. Wolf, in the warmth of the cow beside him, understood finally that life in Dunsmuir was sustained not by isolation, nor by wealth, nor by luck, but by the bond between man and beast, by shared breath and shared strength, by enduring together through every storm, every hunger, every season. The early autumn air carried a sharpness that made the village awake before the sun had fully risen. Elric stepped out into the mist, his breath forming small clouds as he adjusted the yoke on the ox. Wolf followed, carrying a bucket for the cow, his small hands already stiff from the chill. The fields, once golden with wheat, had begun to brown at the edges, and the grass along the paths had hardened from the night's cold. Merwin stood in the doorway, holding Edric close, watching her husband and son, the worry in her eyes softened by the hope that the harvest would hold. The animals sensed the season as well. The cow shifted uneasily, the goats bleated softly, and the hens clucked with restless energy. As they worked, Elric explained the ways to protect the crops from the encroaching cold. "See the wind," he said, pointing to the sway of the trees at the forest's edge. "It comes from the north. Frost will follow. We must finish before the first frost bites the ground." Wolf nodded, understanding that this was no idle lesson but survival in its purest form. The boy had grown stronger in these months, his muscles tight, his hands skilled, his mind attentive. He noticed patterns now, how the ox slowed when the soil was too soft, how the cow pawed the earth when rain threatened, how even the goat's behavior could predict the weather. By midday, the sun broke through a patchwork of clouds, casting a dull gold over the fields. Wolf and Elric paused for a simple meal of bread, cheese, and a few apples Merwin had saved from the orchard. The cow rested nearby, her large brown eyes watching, patient and steady. Wolf fed her small clumps of hay, thinking of the months she had kept them alive in winter's deep freeze. He patted her flank and whispered, "We wouldn't have made it without you." The cow responded with a soft lowing, a sound that seemed almost human in its understanding. The afternoon was spent in steady labor. The ox pulled the plough through the stubborn earth, while Wolf and Elric gathered fallen branches and cleared stones. The forest on the horizon shimmered in the heat haze, its edges mysterious and inviting yet full of danger. Elric warned Wolf not to wander, for the woods were home to more than deer and birds, wild dogs. Foxes and other predators moved quietly among the trees. Wolf obeyed, though he felt a strange pull toward the shade and the quiet of the forest. Imagining the stories the elders told of spirits that roamed at night. When the work was done, the family returned to the cottage. Merwin had prepared a small stew, and the children ate quickly, their hunger sharpening the taste. After the meal, they tended the animals, brushing the cow's coat, gathering eggs from the hens, and checking the goat's hooves for injury. The practice had become second nature to Wolf. He moved with confidence, recognizing the importance of every action. The animals, in turn, had learned trust, responding calmly to the careful hands of those who had shared their lives for months. The nights grew longer and colder as September advanced. The fire in the hearth became the center of life, the flickering flames providing warmth and a sense of security. Wolf lay beside the cow, feeling the heat radiate through his body. The goats curled near the walls, the hens tucked into corners. Outside, the wind rattled the thatch and the trees groaned under its pressure, but inside life persisted. Every breath, every heartbeat, every movement of the animals was a reassurance, a quiet assertion that they had survived another day. One morning, a messenger arrived from the Lord's manor, demanding part of the grain harvest for taxes. The villagers murmured their discontent, yet there was no refusal. Elric packed part of the collected grain, ensuring that enough remained to see his family through the winter. Wolf watched, absorbing the harsh lesson that life was never entirely under one's control. That generosity and duty to those above came at the expense of immediate comfort, and that survival required careful calculation and discipline. The harvest itself became a focus. Each day, Wolf and Elric worked side by side, cutting stalks of wheat, tying them into sheaves, and storing them in the loft above the cottage. The ox moved steadily under the weight of the cart, and the cow followed behind, her presence a constant warmth. Merwin sorted vegetables, preserved fruit, and tended the fire, her movements efficient and precise. The cottage was alive with motion, yet beneath the busyness lay a steady heartbeat, the rhythm of survival, a bond unbroken between humans and animals alike. During the evenings, Wolf reflected on the year that had passed. He remembered the bitter winter, the storms, the illness, and the long, exhausting labor. Yet he also remembered the warmth of the animals, the comfort of the hearth, and the small moments of joy, Edric's laughter, Merwin's gentle hands, the playful nudge of a goat, the soft breath of the cow beside him. He understood now that life in Dunsmuir was sustained not only through labor and planning, but also through the intimacy shared with those who depended on each other for warmth, food, and companionship. As October approached, the nights became chilling, the air crisp with frost. The family began preparations for winter, repairing the roof, stacking firewood, sealing cracks, and bringing the animals closer to the hearth. Wolf noticed the subtle signs in the animals. The cow shifted to a spot nearer the fire. The goats huddled closer to each other, and even the hens seemed to settle more snugly in the corners. These small adjustments mirrored human instinct, a shared understanding of the cold to come and the measures necessary to survive it. The moon rose high one evening, silvering the thatch and the mud below. Wolf lay beside the cow, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, the soft shuffle of the goats, the cluck of hens settling for the night. Merwin hummed softly as she stitched a patch on his father's tunic. Edric nestled against her chest. The world outside was dark, silent and indifferent, yet inside the cottage, warmth and life endured. Wolf understood now why his family had always shared their home with the animals, not merely for warmth, but for survival, for comfort, for the fragile continuity of life in a world that offered no guarantees. The winter preparations continued, grain secured, firewood stacked, and the cottage cleaned and reinforced. Each evening, the animals were brought inside, their warmth and presence essential to the household. Wolf observed, learned, and adapted, recognizing that the line between human and animal survival was thin, and that neglect of either could mean disaster. He felt the weight of responsibility, the gravity of interdependence, and a quiet pride of belonging to a family that endured together. The days shortened, shadows lengthened, and the first frost began to touch the edges of the fields. Wolf watched it form in the hollows of the land, a warning of the cold months ahead. Inside, the cottage remained a haven. The fire blazed, the animals pressed close, and the family continued their daily rituals. Wolf, lying beside the cow, felt the warmth seep into his body and soul, a living proof that survival required both effort and connection, that life's continuity depended on respect for every creature, every breath, and every heartbeat. The first snows of late autumn drifted quietly over Dunsmuir, coating the thatched roofs and muddy lanes with a soft, white veil. The village moved slower now, the chill pressing into bones and making each task heavier. Wolf rose early, rubbing his eyes as the cold seeped into the cottage. The cow huddled near the hearth, her breath steaming in the frosty air, while the goats shuffled close to one another, seeking warmth. The hens, less tolerant of cold, nestled into piles of straw. Their soft clucks acquired rhythm that filled the room. Merwin stirred the fire, tossing in a small log, the orange glow spreading across the floor and bathing the family in light. Elric emerged from the small loft, carrying the tools needed to clear snow and check the fences. The ox shifted in the corner, its breath clouding the air as it waited patiently for the day's work. Wolf followed, gripping a broom to sweep the pathways, careful not to slip on the icy ground. "The snow will only get worse," Elric said, glancing toward the hills. "We must keep the paths clear, or the animals and we will suffer." Wolf nodded, already understanding the necessity. The animals depended on them as much as they depended on the animals. Survival was a web, each strand vital to the whole. Outside, the world was quiet, muffled by the fresh snow. The fields lay blanketed and still, the faint outline of frozen streams catching the pale sunlight. Wolf led the goats along the cleared path, their hooves crunching against the snow. The cow followed more slowly, her large eyes watching every movement, her breath steady and warm. The ox pulled the small cart filled with kindling and straw, a routine they had perfected over years of winters. The air smelled of frost, damp hay, and smoke from distant chimneys. It was bitter, yet familiar, a harsh companion to daily life. By midday, the sun had moved behind heavy clouds, casting a grey pall over the village. The family gathered inside for a small meal of porridge and bread. Edric cooed and reached for the cow's nearby flank, fascinated by her warmth. Merwin smiled and patted his small hand, while Wolf took a bite of bread and thought of the work still to be done. Elric reminded him to keep the fire strong, to check the water for freezing, and to ensure the animals were sheltered properly. The winter demanded vigilance, and any lapse could mean frostbite, illness, or worse. The afternoon was spent shoveling snow from the roof and fortifying the walls. Wolf learned to pile straw against the base of the cottage, insulating it from the cold ground. The animals watched quietly, sensing the change in routine, their movements measured and deliberate. The cow lowed softly when a gust of wind rattled the shutters, and Wolf pressed close to her side, drawing strength from her warmth. Each motion, each breath, was a reassurance of continuity. The cold was an enemy, but it could be met with patience, effort, and unity. As evening fell, the family returned inside, the cottage glowing with the fire's light. The animals were brought near the hearth, the cow lying with her flanks close to Wolf and Edric, while the goats huddled along the wall. The hens settled into corners of straw, soft feathers rustling as they moved. The smell of hay, sweat, and smoke filled the room, a dense but comforting aroma. Merwin stirred a small stew, the aroma blending with the warmth, creating a sense of safety despite the cold that pressed from outside. Night deepened, and Wolf lay beside the cow, listening to her steady breathing. The first frost had left traces on the small window panes, delicate patterns of ice that glittered faintly in the firelight. Wolf thought of the months past, the storms, the fever, the labor of the fields, the closeness of the animals. He understood now that each winter, each hardship was a test of endurance not just for humans, but for the creatures that shared their lives. Their survival depended on mutual care, an unspoken understanding that each being had a role in the fragile continuity of life. Over the following days, snow deepened and the village slowed further. Elric and Wolf checked fences daily, ensuring the livestock would not wander into drifted fields. Merwin brought in fresh hay, careful to layer it thickly beneath the animals' resting spots. Wolf marveled at the cow's patience, the ox's resilience, and the goat's cleverness in navigating the icy paths. Each action, however small, contributed to the preservation of life. The family observed patterns in the animals' behavior, subtle warnings of approaching storms, shifts in body temperature signaling the need for extra bedding. One night, a gale swept across the village, rattling doors and windows and shaking the beams of the cottage. The cow bellowed softly, the goats pressed close, and Wolf shivered under the chill despite the warmth of the hearth. Elric reinforced the shutters while Merwin moved pods beneath the drips of water, seeping through the roof. The family held steady, enduring the storm through effort, vigilance, and the silent reassurance of shared warmth. The night seemed endless, but by dawn the wind had calmed, and the sun glinted off the snow in pale brilliance. The first weeks of winter were a test of endurance. Each day required tending the animals, maintaining the fire, checking the water supply, and preserving the small stores of food. Wolf learned to balance labor with care, understanding that overwork could harm both humans and animals alike. The cow's milk, collected carefully, became a vital source of nutrition. The goat's presence provided warmth and companionship, while the hen's eggs were counted and stored methodically. Every task, no matter how menial, contributed to the survival of the household. As the moon rose high one night, casting silver light across the frozen landscape, Wolf lay beside the cow, Edric nestled in Merwin's arms. The fire crackled softly, the goats stirred in their corners, and the hens clucked quietly. The rhythm of life persisted, fragile yet enduring. Wolf understood fully why his family had always shared their home with animals, not only for warmth or utility, but for the continuity of life itself. A partnership honed over centuries. Each breath, each heartbeat, each movement mattered, binding humans and beasts together against the harsh indifference of the world outside. The cold months pressed on, and the family adapted. They learned to predict frost, ration food, and keep the hearth alive for as long as possible. Wolf noted the way the animals shifted positions at night, curling closer or farther depending on the chill. He observed the cow's heavy breathing, the goat's restless feet, and the hen's soft clucks, learning to read them as he would a human companion. Survival demanded attention, but it also fostered connection, a deep understanding of the bond between humans and creatures who shared warmth, and sustenance in a world that offered no guarantees. Evenings became moments of reflection. The family sat together by the fire, tending their meals, checking the animals, and whispering prayers for protection. Wolf lay close to the cow, her steady warmth seeping into him. He thought of the past seasons, the storms, the floods, the illness, and the long days of labor. Through it all, the animals had been constant, patient, and enduring. They were more than mere beasts. They were partners, protectors, and sources of quiet comfort. The bond between man and animal, forged in hardship and nurtured by care, was the invisible structure that held the family together. The snow continued to fall lightly each night, dusting the village in white, and Wolf felt a quiet satisfaction in their survival. Each day was a cycle of work, care, and rest, every action deliberate, every breath shared. The cow, the goats, the hens, all contributed to the endurance of the household. Wolf understood now that their survival depended not only on toil and foresight, but on respect, attentiveness, and the unspoken agreement that life, fragile as it was, must be shared to persist. Winter deepened over Dunsmuir, blanketing the village and fields in thick snow that muffled footsteps and turned the world silent. The air was sharp and stinging, biting through layers of wool and fur, and the sun rose late, casting pale light over the frozen landscape. Elric rose before dawn, careful not to wake his family, and dressed in layered tunics and a thick cloak. Wolf followed, his small hands wrapped in cloth, boots heavy with the ice that had formed overnight. The cow huddled near the hearth, her sides heaving with warmth, and the goats pressed together in the corner, their small bodies vibrating with life. Merwin stirred the fire, its glow reflecting in her tired eyes as she checked the baby, Edric, sleeping quietly against her chest. The morning chores were more difficult than ever. Paths had frozen solid, the snow hardened into slippery crusts that threatened both man and beast. Wolf led the goats carefully along the cleared lane, guiding them with gentle words and soft nudges, while Elric broke the ice in the water trough and checked the fence lines for damage. The cow's breath steamed in the cold air as she followed patiently, her large eyes watchful and trusting. The ox pulled a small sled of straw and firewood, each step deliberate against the icy ground. Wolf marveled at the animal's resilience, understanding that their survival relied as much on instinct as human care. By mid-morning, the sun was high enough to soften the frost slightly, but the cold remained persistent. The family paused for a simple meal of porridge sweetened with a small amount of honey, bread, and some dried fruit stored from the autumn harvest. Edric gurgled happily, reaching toward the cow's flank, fascinated by her warmth and calm presence. Wolf smiled and patted the cow gently, whispering, "You keep us alive, always." The cow responded with a soft lowing, a sound that seemed almost like an answer, a quiet acknowledgement of their bond. Merwin watched the exchange and allowed herself a faint smile, knowing the boy had begun to understand the delicate balance of care and dependence that sustained their household. The day was spent tending the animals and securing supplies. Wolf chopped firewood under Aelric's careful eye, stacking logs near the hearth for easy access during the long nights. The cow was brushed and checked for signs of illness, her hooves cleaned of ice and mud. The goats were fed and their hooves trimmed to prevent slipping, while the hens were kept close in straw-lined corners to conserve warmth. Every motion was precise, deliberate, and necessary. Wolf realized that even small lapses could have consequences. A frozen water bucket, a neglected animal, or a misjudged path could threaten survival in this harsh season. By evening, the wind had picked up, carrying snowflakes that drove across the village with sharp, slicing force. The family gathered inside, the hearth blazing with warmth. The cow and goats pressed close for heat and comfort. Merwin stirred a small stew, the aroma mingling with the smell of straw, hay, and smoke from the fire. Wolf lay beside the cow, feeling the steady rise and fall of her flanks against his body, absorbing warmth and reassurance. He listened to the soft clucks of the hens and the occasional shuffle of the goats, understanding that their presence was as much a part of the household as the fire, or the walls themselves. The nights grew long and bitter. Wolf often woke to check the animals, moving quietly to avoid waking the baby or his parents. The cow's steady breathing, the goat's gentle movements, and the hen's soft rustling were a comfort against the darkness and cold. Wolf learned to read the signs of frostbite or illness, noticing when the cow shifted to avoid cold, when the goats pressed together for warmth, and when the hens huddled unusually close. The boy realized that survival depended not only on labor, but on attentiveness, understanding, and respect for the creatures who shared their lives. One particularly harsh night, a storm roared across the village, rattling the shutters and shaking the roof. The cow bellowed softly, the goats pressed closer, and Wolf huddled against the animal's warm side. Elric reinforced the doors and checked the fire, Merwin moving quietly to ensure the baby was secure and warm. The storm raged through the night, relentless and punishing, yet inside the cottage, life persisted. The animal's warmth, combined with the family's vigilance, was a shield against the winter's fury, a fragile but enduring barrier that allowed them to endure another day. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine layer of snow across the village. Icicles hung from the eaves, and the fields glimmered under a pale sun. The family emerged to inspect the damage. Fences were bent, the roof had leaked slightly, and some paths were completely blocked. The animals were unharmed, though restless, sensing the harshness of the weather yet calm within the safety of their shelter. Wolf helped clear snow and repair minor damage, learning that survival was a continuous task. A careful balance of effort, observation, and care for both humans and animals. As winter deepened, the daily routines became rituals. Feeding, watering, checking the animals, chopping wood, tending the fire, and preparing meals formed an unbroken cycle. Wolf observed the subtle behaviors of the cow, goats, and hens, understanding their needs and moods. He noticed patterns, the cow shifting her weight to conserve warmth, the goats nuzzling to maintain body heat, and the hens fluffing their feathers to protect themselves from frost. Each day was a lesson in attentiveness and respect, a demonstration of how survival depended on shared effort and mutual care. Despite the harshness of the season, moments of quiet joy persisted. Wolf and his parents would gather near the fire after chores, sharing stories or singing softly, while the animals rested close. The cow's breathing, the goats shifting, and the hen's soft clucks became part of the rhythm of these evenings, a background to the warmth and light that filled the cottage. Wolf learned that life in winter was not only about endurance, but also about presence, the small, continuous acts that sustained both human and animal alike. The days were punctuated by occasional trips to neighboring cottages, exchanging news, bartering for supplies, and checking on each other's livestock. Wolf observed the same attentiveness in other families, noting how animals were central to survival across the village. Each family had developed similar rhythms and strategies, a testament to the unspoken understanding that life was fragile and interconnected, that humans and beasts depended upon each other to endure the cold and hunger of the long months. Night after night, Wolf lay beside the cow, the goats huddled nearby, and the hens in their straw nests. The fire crackled softly, the only light in the dim cottage. Wolf reflected on the lessons of the year, the storms, the rains, the fever, the harvest, and the long labor of survival. He understood fully now why medieval families kept animals so close, why warmth and companionship were inseparable from life, and how the bond between man and beast ensured continuity, protection, and resilience against the harsh, indifferent world outside. As the snow deepened and the wind howled beyond the walls, Wolf felt a profound sense of connection. The animal's warmth, presence, and steady rhythm had become inseparable from the family's survival. He understood that life in Dunsmuir was a delicate balance of work, care, and vigilance, where humans and animals relied on each other not merely for warmth or food, but for the very persistence of life itself. Each breath, each heartbeat, each subtle movement was a thread in the fabric of survival, fragile yet unbroken, binding the family and their animals together through the long, unforgiving winter. Winter deepened over Dunsmuir, blanketing the village and fields in thick snow that muffled footsteps and turned the world silent. The air was sharp and stinging, biting through layers of wool and fur, and the sun rose late, casting pale light over the frozen landscape. Elric rose before dawn, careful not to wake his family, and dressed in layered tunics and a thick cloak. Wolf followed, his small hands wrapped in cloth, boots heavy with the ice that had formed overnight. The cow huddled near the hearth, her sides heaving with warmth, and the goats pressed together in the corner, their small bodies vibrating with life. Merwin stirred the fire, its glow reflecting in her tired eyes as she checked the baby, Edric, sleeping quietly against her chest. The morning chores were more difficult than ever. Paths had frozen solid, the snow hardened into slippery crusts that threatened both man and beast. Wolf led the goats carefully along the cleared lane, guiding them with gentle words and soft nudges, while Elric broke the ice in the water trough and checked the fence lines for damage. The cow's breath steamed in the cold air as she followed patiently, her large eyes watchful and trusting. The ox pulled a small sled of straw and firewood, each step deliberate against the icy ground. Wolf marveled at the animals' resilience, understanding that their survival relied as much on instinct as human care. By mid-morning, the sun was high enough to soften the frost slightly, but the cold remained persistent. The family paused for a simple meal of porridge sweetened with a small amount of honey, bread, and some dried fruit stored from the autumn harvest. Edric gurgled happily, reaching toward the cow's flank, fascinated by her warmth and calm presence. Wolf smiled and patted the cow gently, whispering, "You keep us alive, always." The cow responded with a soft lowing, a sound that seemed almost like an answer, a quiet acknowledgement of their bond. Merwin watched the exchange and allowed herself a faint smile, knowing the boy had begun to understand the delicate balance of care and dependence that sustained their household. The day was spent tending the animals and securing supplies. Wolf chopped firewood under Aelric's careful eye, stacking logs near the hearth for easy access during the long nights. The cow was brushed and checked for signs of illness, her hooves cleaned of ice and mud. The goats were fed and their hooves trimmed to prevent slipping, while the hens were kept close in straw-lined corners to conserve warmth. Every motion was precise, deliberate, and necessary. Wolf realized that even small lapses could have consequences. A frozen water bucket, a neglected animal, or a misjudged path could threaten survival in this harsh season. By evening, the wind had picked up, carrying snowflakes that drove across the village with sharp, slicing force. The family gathered inside, the hearth blazing with warmth. The cow and goats pressed close for heat and comfort. Merwin stirred a small stew, the aroma mingling with the smell of straw, hay, and smoke from the fire. Wolf lay beside the cow, feeling the steady rise and fall of her flanks against his body, absorbing warmth and reassurance. He listened to the soft clucks of the hens and the occasional shuffle of the goats, understanding that their presence was as much a part of the household as the fire, or the walls themselves. The nights grew long and bitter. Wolf often woke to check the animals, moving quietly to avoid waking the baby or his parents. The cow's steady breathing, the goat's gentle movements, and the hen's soft rustling were a comfort against the darkness and cold. Wolf learned to read the signs of frostbite or illness, noticing when the cow shifted to avoid cold, when the goats pressed together for warmth, and when the hens huddled unusually close. The boy realized that survival depended not only on labor, but on attentiveness, understanding, and respect for the creatures who shared their lives. One particularly harsh night, a storm roared across the village, rattling the shutters and shaking the roof. The cow bellowed softly, the goats pressed closer, and Wolf huddled against the animal's warm side. Elric reinforced the doors and checked the fire, Merwin moving quietly to ensure the baby was secure and warm. The storm raged through the night, relentless and punishing, yet inside the cottage, life persisted. The animal's warmth, combined with the family's vigilance, was a shield against the winter's fury, a fragile but enduring barrier that allowed them to endure another day. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine layer of snow across the village. Icicles hung from the eaves, and the fields glimmered under a pale sun. The family emerged to inspect the damage. Fences were bent, the roof had leaked slightly, and some paths were completely blocked. The animals were unharmed, though restless, sensing the harshness of the weather yet calm within the safety of their shelter. Wolf helped clear snow and repair minor damage, learning that survival was a continuous task. A careful balance of effort, observation, and care for both humans and animals. As winter deepened, the daily routines became rituals. Feeding, watering, checking the animals, chopping wood, tending the fire, and preparing meals formed an unbroken cycle. Wolf observed the subtle behaviors of the cow, goats, and hens, understanding their needs and moods. He noticed patterns, the cow shifting her weight to conserve warmth, the goats nuzzling to maintain body heat, and the hens fluffing their feathers to protect themselves from frost. Each day was a lesson in attentiveness and respect, a demonstration of how survival depended on shared effort and mutual care. Despite the harshness of the season, moments of quiet joy persisted. Wolf and his parents would gather near the fire after chores, sharing stories or singing softly, while the animals rested close, the cows breathing, the goats shifting, and the hens' soft clucks became part of the rhythm of these evenings, a background to the warmth and light that filled the cottage. Wolf learned that life in winter was not only about endurance, but also about presence, the small, continuous acts that sustained both human and animal alike. The days were punctuated by occasional trips to neighboring cottages, exchanging news, bartering for supplies, and checking on each other's livestock. Wolf observed the same attentiveness in other families, noting how animals were central to survival across the village. Each family had developed similar rhythms and strategies, a testament to the unspoken understanding that life was fragile and interconnected, that humans and beasts depended upon each other to endure the cold and hunger of the long months. Night after night, Wolf lay beside the cow, the goats huddled nearby, and the hens in their straw nests. The fire crackled softly, the only light in the dim cottage. Wolf reflected on the lessons of the year, the storms, the rains, the fever, the harvest, and the long labor of survival. He understood fully now why medieval families kept animals so close, why warmth and companionship were inseparable from life, and how the bond between man and beast ensured continuity, protection, and resilience against the harsh, indifferent world outside. As the snow deepened and the wind howled beyond the walls, Wolf felt a profound sense of connection. The animals' warmth, presence, and steady rhythm had become inseparable from the family's survival. He understood that life in Dunsmuir was a delicate balance of work, care, and vigilance, where humans and animals relied on each other not merely for warmth or food, but for the very persistence of life itself. Each breath, each heartbeat, each subtle movement was a thread in the fabric of survival, fragile yet unbroken, binding the family and their animals together through the long, unforgiving winter. The thaw came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Days stretched a little longer, and the sun began to pierce the thick clouds that had blanketed Dunsmuir for months. The snow that once covered the fields in hard white layers softened to patches of slush and dark earth. Elric stepped outside one morning to see the first faint green shoots pushing through the thawed soil, fragile but defiant. He smiled faintly, breathing in air that, for the first time in weeks, didn't sting his lungs with frost. The sound of dripping water filled the air, melting snow sliding from the thatch roof, trickling down into the muddy earth below. Inside the cottage, the warmth from the hearth mingled with the animal scents that had grown familiar. The rhythm of breathing, the sounds of life returning to motion. Wolf woke beside the cow as he had done all winter. Her warmth had become part of his existence, the steady sound of her breathing a reminder that they had endured together. He rose quietly, so as not to startle her, and opened the shutter just enough to let a shaft of light spill across the room. Dust motes danced in the golden air, and the cow stirred, her large eyes calm, her ears twitching toward the faint chirping of birds outside. Wolf smiled, realizing that the silence of winter was finally giving way to sound and life. Merwin busied herself preparing a morning meal, coarse bread toasted near the fire, a pot of warm milk sweetened with a touch of honey. Edric clapped his small hands, laughing as the goat nosed near his cradle, searching for warmth. Elric stepped inside, brushing snow from his cloak, his expression thoughtful but relieved. "It's nearly time," he said, setting his gloves by the fire. "The fields will need turning soon." Merwin nodded, her eyes reflecting both anticipation and fatigue. The winter had tested them all, but the promise of spring stirred energy and hope. The family began the slow process of returning the animals to their outdoor routines. The goats were the first to venture out, eager for the patchy grass and new scents. Wolf followed them closely, guiding their movements with practiced care. The cow stepped cautiously from the cottage, her hooves pressing into the soft mud. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, turning her head back toward the hearth as if reluctant to leave the warmth that had been their shared refuge. Wolf touched her flank gently. "Go on," he whispered. "The cold's ending." She snorted softly and began to move forward, her breath visible in the cool air. The sounds of the village began to change as well. Neighbors emerged from their homes, repairing fences, clearing debris, and leading animals into the light. Smoke still rose from every chimney, but laughter and conversation now echoed faintly through the air. Children chased each other across the muddy lanes, their boots splashing through thawing puddles. Old men leaned on fences, talking of how the frost had bitten deeper than years before, and whether the harvest ahead would be kind. Each day grew longer, and the rhythm of life shifted once again. Wolf spent his mornings helping Elric repair tools and check the plough blades, afternoons clearing the small plot of land where they grew turnips and barley. The animals remained near the cottage, their movements slower, more deliberate after months confined indoors. The cow grazed peacefully, her tail flicking lazily, while the goats climbed low rocks, bleating softly. The hens began laying again, their quiet clucks punctuating the hum of activity around the farm. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Elric stood beside Wolf at the edge of the pasture. "You've learned well this winter," he said, his gaze on the animals. "When I was your age, I thought sleeping with beasts was beneath us, but I see now. It's not about pride. It's about knowing how life depends on life." Wolf nodded, his face lit by the amber glow. "They kept us warm," he said simply, "and we kept them safe." Elric smiled faintly. "That's the way of things." The nights were still cold, and though the animals no longer stayed constantly within the cottage, the habit lingered. The cow often returned to the doorway before dusk, as if reluctant to leave entirely. Merwin would open the door and let her in, smiling softly as the great creature settled down beside the hearth once more. The warmth she brought filled the room faster than the fire alone could manage. The goats followed on particularly chilly nights, pressing against the walls, their presence as natural as the flicker of the flames. The villagers often spoke of the coming planting season with cautious hope. Some muttered about omens, a raven seen circling near the well, a strange pattern in the melting snow, while others simply counted the days, until the soil would be soft enough to till. Elric listened but said little. He believed in work more than signs. Still, Merwin sometimes left small offerings, a bit of bread, a splash of milk, near the threshold, whispering quiet words of thanks to the unseen forces they believed watched over hearth and field alike. The days blended into a rhythm of preparation. Tools were mended, fences reinforced, and supplies inventoried. Wolf helped his father ready the plough, his hands raw from the cold but steady. He had grown taller over the winter, his face leaner, his movements more deliberate. Each action spoke of maturity, a boy becoming part of the endless cycle of seasons and labor. He often paused to watch the animals, marveling at their quiet patience, their unspoken understanding of life's rhythm. As the equinox neared, the first true warmth returned. Streams thawed and ran freely again, filling the air with the soft murmur of water. The earth smelled rich and alive, and the birds sang louder each morning. The villagers gathered in the open fields, exchanging greetings, comparing livestock, and preparing for the year's first work. There was a lightness in the air, a shared relief that the long, punishing winter had ended. That night, the family sat near the hearth as they always had, but the air felt different, alive, hopeful. The cow lay near the doorway, dozing softly, while the goats settled in the corner. The faint scent of spring drifted in through the open window. Merwin hummed an old tune, one her grandmother had sung about the turning of seasons and the renewal of life. Wolf listened quietly, his eyes on the dancing flames. He thought about the long months behind them, the biting cold, the endless dark, the shared breath of animal and human. He remembered how he had pressed against the cow's warmth when the wind howled outside, how the goat's soft bleats had kept the silence from becoming unbearable. In those moments, he understood what his father meant, that survival was never a solitary act. It was built from the small, intertwined lives that filled their world, each giving something the other needed. As sleep came that night, the cow stirred once more, shifting her weight, her breath steady and rhythmic. The fire burned low, casting gentle light over the family and the animals who had endured together. Outside, the snow melted quietly, the first frogs croaked in distant puddles, and the promise of spring deepened in the earth. In that moment, the meaning of their life together was clear, not as a story of hardship, but of harmony. The warmth that had once been born of necessity had become something more enduring, a quiet companionship between human and beast, the essence of medieval survival, the reason they had always and would always sleep beside one another. Spring finally arrived in Dunsmuir with a quiet persistence, melting the remaining snow and leaving the village and fields softened, wet, and alive. The air smelled of earth and new growth, a mixture of warmth and damp that carried the promise of renewal. Wolf woke early, as he had throughout winter, though now the chill no longer bit through the blankets. The cow stirred beside the hearth, her breath warm and comforting, while the goats pressed together in the corners, their bodies buzzing with renewed energy. The hens clucked softly, moving through the straw, searching for early insects in the warm sunlight streaming through the window. Nairn prepared the morning meal, her hands steady and sure, the fire casting golden light over the cottage, while Edric stretched in his cradle, cooing in delight at the change in light and air. The family stepped outside to inspect the land. The frost had lifted entirely from the fields, leaving dark, rich soil dotted with tiny shoots of green. Elric ran his hands along the edges of the plough, checking for readiness. "It's time to work the earth," he said. Wolf followed closely, carrying tools and supplies, feeling the mud squish between his boots and the warmth of the sun on his back. The animals moved more freely now, the cow grazing near the edge of the pasture, the goats leaping over low fences and into new patches of grass, the hens scratching and pecking at insects emerging from the warming soil. Life pulsed in every direction, a rhythm of movement and growth after months of confinement and cold. As the family worked, Wolf realized how much he had changed over the winter. His hands were calloused, his muscles stronger, his mind sharper. He watched the animals' movements closely, noticing subtle signals, the cow's calm grazing when she was content, the goat's soft nudges when curious, the hen's faint clucks signaling the discovery of worms in the mud. He understood now the delicate balance that sustained life, attention, care, and an awareness that every creature's needs were part of the household's survival. Evenings returned to the familiar routine, though the animals began spending more time outside. The cow would linger near the doorway, stepping back in to press her warmth against Wolf or Edric when the sun dipped low. The goats, though more active in the warming air, still settled in corners of the cottage at night, and the hens found comfort in straw-lined nests near the fire. The warmth shared over winter had become habit, a thread of connection that neither season nor sunlight could sever. The villagers began preparing for planting, working together to share tools, exchange advice, and discuss the coming harvest. Wolf observed their interactions, seeing how every household relied on both human skill and animal labor. Plows pulled by oxen, seeds carried in baskets, and animals kept nearby for warmth and companionship all formed part of a network of life that extended beyond a single cottage. Knowledge and survival were intertwined, passed down through work, observation, and the intimacy of daily care. One afternoon, as Wolf led the cow back from the pasture, he noticed the first flowers breaking through the thawed earth. Their colors, yellows, whites, purples, seemed impossibly bright against the muddy landscape. The cow lowed softly, grazing beside the blooms, while the goat sniffed at the shoots. Wolf bent to touch the tender petals, thinking of the long months of snow and cold, of the warmth that had kept them alive. He understood now that the shared life between humans and animals was not merely practical, but sacred, a bond rooted in endurance, care, and companionship. As planting began, the family worked tirelessly, turning soil, sowing seeds, and tending small patches of early vegetables. The cow followed patiently, grazing at the edges, while the goats explored the new growth and the hens clucked softly, picking through the dirt. Each movement of the animals seemed purposeful, instinctive, a part of the household's rhythm. Wolf marveled at the harmony, how survival, labor, and companionship flowed together seamlessly, a living demonstration of the medieval way of life that had seemed harsh in winter, but revealed itself now as precise, enduring, and deeply connected. Evening fell with gentle light, a far cry from the dark, cold nights of winter. The family gathered near the hearth, though now it was more for warmth and comfort than necessity. The cow pressed close to Wolf, her warmth a familiar reassurance, while the goats nestled nearby, and the hens settled into their nests. Merwin hummed softly, her voice blending with the crackle of the fire, the clucks of the hens, and the steady breathing of the cow. Edric, wrapped in her arms, smiled and reached toward the animals. Fascinated by their presence and comforted by their warmth, the village itself transformed with the season. Roads that had been empty during winter now buzzed with life, children running to visit neighbors, men and women carrying tools and seeds, the sounds of animals interwoven with human voices. Villagers spoke openly of the harsh winter now behind them, of the lessons learned, and of the small victories earned through care, attention, and persistence. Wolf listened carefully, absorbing wisdom that extended beyond the household, learning that survival depended on both family and community, on animals as much as on human skill. As spring progressed, the animals' routines shifted again. The cow spent more time grazing, though she still returned in the evenings to the cottage, settling near the hearth and offering warmth and comfort. The goats explored further each day, leaping and playing, while the hens ventured outdoors to forage but still returned to familiar straw nests at night. Wolf watched them, fascinated by their instincts and adaptability. He realized that the winter had been a teacher, demonstrating the importance of proximity, care, and shared life in ways that words alone could never convey. The family began planning for summer, preparing to store early crops and repair the cottage for warmer months. Wolf, now stronger, more attentive, and more knowledgeable, moved among the animals and tools with purpose and confidence. He noticed details others might overlook, the cow's subtle shifts indicating discomfort, the goat's movements signaling hunger or curiosity, the hen's clucking hinting at a hidden nest. Each signal informed the household's actions, ensuring continued survival and comfort for every being in the cottage. One warm evening, the family sat outside by the hearth, the cow grazing nearby and the goats resting in soft grass. Wolf watched the sunlight glint off Edric's hair and thought of the long winter behind them. He remembered the biting cold, the long nights, the shared warmth of the animals, and the sense of unity that had kept them alive. Now, with spring fully arrived, he understood that their survival was not merely a story of endurance, but of interdependence, trust, and companionship between human and animal alike. As night fell, the cottage glowed with firelight, the cow laying close, the goats in their corners, and the hens in straw nests. Wolf felt the steady pulse of life surrounding him, the breathing of the cow, the rustle of straw under the goats, the faint clucks of the hens. He realized that the medieval custom of sleeping with animals had not been born of mere convenience or superstition, but of necessity, care, and a profound understanding of shared survival. With spring fully embracing the land, the family worked and lived with renewed energy. The animals' presence continued to be central to their lives, a source of warmth, sustenance, and comfort. Wolf often reflected on the bond formed over the long winter, recognizing that these creatures were more than companions, they were partners in life, essential to the continuity of the household. Each breath, each heartbeat, each movement, human and animal alike, mattered, woven together in a tapestry of survival, care, and enduring connection. In the glow of spring evenings, as the village began to hum with life, Wolf lay beside the cow one last time before turning to the warmth of the fire. The goats shifted slightly, the hens clucked softly, and Edric snuggled against Merwin. Outside, the world had transformed, yet inside the cottage, the rhythm of shared life persisted. Wolf understood fully why his family had kept the animals close through winter. It was a bond of survival, comfort, and trust, a lesson that would endure through every season to come.